You ever played something that just clicks with you the first time around? Something that hooks you in thinking you've been playing for 5 minutes, but in reality it's been much more than that? Well, the first Quake was that title for me. It was a franchise I wasn't as acquainted with as, say, Doom at the time, but Quake 1 felt good to play, like really good. And it was a game from '96 as well. Ever since then, it's been replicated in one way or another, but would go beyond what that game set out to do. The boomer shooter scene is a reflection of that time period more or less, at least it was for the past couple of years, and yet now we're seeing some of them break out of the Quake and Doom formula, and venturing forth towards different types of shooters or other types of genres. Take for instance Blood West or Gloomwood, or take another game like Lunacid, a dungeon crawler that's similar to the old From Software games like Kingsfield. They're games with a boomer shooter surface visually, but past that you'll find that they play completely different from what we normally see in the boomer shooter scene. Personally, I'm happy to see the scene break the mold and experiment with other old ideas or other genres within that particular scene. But some games will keep the Quake train going no matter what, and the game that I'm talking about in this video keeps it going for only about $1. This is Carnal, an old school 90s inspired shooter developed by Mercysoft that tries to emulate something from the years 96 and 97, something that feels early and made in a different 90s dimension. Most shooters just make the graphics retro and just leaves it at that, modernizing everything else. Carnal, however, seems to get it, nailing down the aspects you'd expect to see in a game and retrogrades everything on purpose to make it feel like a product of its own time. When I started playing this game, I was reminded of early 3D FPS games, most notably Quake 1. The moving ominous skybox, the head bobbing, and the enemies that zerg rush you, but instead of cosmic horror inspired entities and medieval sci-fi settings, you're generally placed in 90s urban settings, full to the brim with burgers and milkshakes, or Coke if that's more your thing. In any event, Carnal is a fantastic game that feels janky but is self-aware of the fact it makes you adapt to its gameplay and its challenges. When it comes to stories and shooters, it was something that took a backseat more or less in the 90s. It wasn't really until games like System Shock and Half-Life pushed the envelope forward, proving that FPS games could have an interesting narrative and storyline to follow, with lore to read into and analyze. Games like Carnal throws that away and gives you pretext to your situation without elaborating much further. You play as a Chad member of the Realm Defense Force, an organization that seeks to prevent otherworldly threats from invading their realm. The enemies of the game, the Sons of Anak, create portals that lead to an invasion across Seed City, which is the bedrock of the game's story. Their plan is to extract dark matter, which they can then use to create devastating weapons. In Quake fashion, you'll be killing everything on sight, finding secrets, keys, other weapons, and eventually the exit door, leading up to the big baddie of the group. That's all there really is story-wise. Nothing else is known about the game, the world, or your character really, other than just being a member of the Realm Defense Force. All we can assume is that he likes burgers and drinks, which you can find a lot of throughout each level. Carnal is just a game that you're going to be in for just the old school gameplay that it has going for it. In terms of the setting though, I quite like it. The levels all blend into this big giant urban city, with a variety of locations from city streets to a supermarket, dams, plants, suburban homes, a carnival for a level which is one of my favourite levels in this game. The developer decided to ignore having a typical sci-fi or fantasy setting and opted for a time period, more specifically something akin to late 90s western settings, but taken over by low poly aliens and soldiers with awful audio sound and near infinite range. It's quirky and campy, levels are all quite expansive and large, with a lot to look at as well, and a lot of enemies to kill, which come in all different shapes and sizes, some really small and some really big. You go from killer dolls, to dinosaurs that shoot rockets, a single xenomorph, a giant statue, and in between that are a mishmash of humanoid enemies that each have a distinct design and function to them. Across 3 episodes and 17 levels, you'll be killing your way through everything, finding keys to unlock doors, secrets to find more goodies, and eventually the exit door to move on to the next level, with some of them having a boss fight here and there. The last levels for each episode act out as the same, but usually ends with a boss fight and a wall of text that explains the results of your actions and what you're planning to do next. The atmosphere is also something to take note of. The levels always feel ominous, even with its wacky and zany vibes. Like the world just doesn't make sense anymore and that you're alone in all this. It's kind of like how in Quake 1 you start off in the Slipgate complex, a place that's familiar but unfamiliar at the same time because of what you're up against. And after the fight is done, you look back and you just realize it's not the same place you remember anymore. In Carnal, it's sort of like that too. But at least the food tastes the same, I think. The Western 90s approach to the world gives it that time capsule feel that I really like, where the developer seems to have understood the world that they were trying to create, taking their idea of the 90s and distorting it with otherworldly elements. The scale of the levels themselves may be too large for some people, but I think it's reflective of what it would have been like in real life, where just running down a block feels like forever. But the speed of this game makes it so that it doesn't seem exactly like that, which is where the gameplay comes in. When people make retro-inspired games, they usually approach it in one way or another. A lot of games play like a modern title, but infused with old-school mechanics and graphics. Some make everything feel retro, from sound to graphics, mechanics and gameplay. Carnal is one of those games that literally throws itself back to the 90s, from the sense of movement, the arcadey feel of the weapons, to the dated animations and the movement mechanics. It was made specifically to be like a game from the 90s. It's a game that feels and plays janky, and you'll notice it right away. Janky means that it's never going to feel right or feel polished, and the more it interferes with your experience, the less of the experience overall, running the risk of putting the game down. However, the developer seems to have drawn a fine line between janky and fun. If you play any of the 3D shooters made in between 96 and 98, you'll find quite a lot of jank in between. Carnal approaches its own design in this way, being janky on purpose by mimicking the style of gameplay found around that time. And honestly, I found it to be quite fun. All the weapons have a very early 3D design to them. The models themselves are shaped very roughly, and over time it kind of grew on me. As for how they perform, I'd say they're pretty functional. I wouldn't say that they have the same level of satisfaction as to something like, say, Doom Eternal or Ultra Kill, but it's good for giving you the sort of gunplay that's old and functional. Enemies are another thing though. It's not a particularly easy game, and it's mainly because of the way some enemies are utilized. The typical grunts will fire endlessly at you, from long range too, especially the ones with the miniguns. There's dudes that fly in the air like buzzards at high speeds, making it very hard to land a hit on them, and the worst ones are these guys. I literally pressed jump as I freaked out at these guys. Probably the fastest enemies I've ever had to deal with. Nearly impossible to hit most of the time, and you have to land your rockets in time to finish them off effectively. And if you're playing on the harder difficulty, I can imagine that a lot of these enemies are going to give you a rough night. Otherwise, the bosses and the other enemies are somewhat manageable, even more so when you realize that because of the large map size, you can freely strafe around the arenas with ease. The dolls themselves can be hard to hit because sometimes the on and off hitboxes can occur, and their smaller sizes in comparison makes it more difficult to concentrate on. And their damage output is alarming too if you allow them to hit you too often. Your best bet to survive each encounter is to take advantage of the large areas and strafe as much as possible, so that you're harder to hit overall. As for the difficulty itself, it definitely has its spikes, and to top it off, you have a live system, where if you run out of lives, you have to start the whole episode again. And the other difficulty just has the one life. But as long as you're not being too aggressive, you should still be able to manage the game just fine, and if you're scouring the map, you can find extra lives to keep you going anyway. The weapons themselves aren't too special, but are fun to use. You have your pistol, shotgun, machine gun, plasma gun, rocket launcher, and a railgun type of weapon that can melt bosses pretty quickly. And as I said, the models themselves are quite rough, but their designs play into the overall art style of the game. A very rough looking 3D game that looks like it came out of the 90s, rather than being a game trying to be like the 90s. Which means that you have to sacrifice a lot for the sake of authenticity, rather than only just emulating the graphics like a lot of indie titles do. Movement itself is very basic, similar to Quake 1 in a sense. You can also swim underwater, which you'll have to do sometimes to kill underwater enemies, as well as finding other items and secrets. I'm usually always skeptical when there's too much jank, but when there's a little bit of it, like say sprinkles, and the game is still fun, then I can still have a good time. If you're looking for a shooter that elevates its basic form of gameplay and overall mechanics in the same vein as games like say Titanfall 2 or Ultra Kill or Doom Eternal, then you won't really find that here. If you want something though that is in the same vein as something like Quake 1 but a bit more janky, then Carnal is perfect for that. especially with how cheap it is. On a technical level, it looks like shit, but so do a lot of late 90s 3D shooters, or say a lot of the boomer shooters that have those same retro style graphics. Time hasn't exactly been friendly with that period, and this game emulates it visually, and does more once you get into the topic of sound. The models overall have a rough appearance, same as with the weapons. Shapes aren't that well defined, but are distinctive enough to tell the differences between each other. Most of the levels, aside from a few unique ones, share a similar level of atmosphere in a similar setting. Artistically, it stands out in its own way. The developer did a fantastic job of replicating graphics from between 96 and 97, and I say those years specifically because you will find lots of other titles with graphics not too far apart from this one around that era. This game, of course, has the advantage of being optimized for newer hardware, and any PC would be able to run this game because of its low poly visuals and sacrifice of high detail. It's not easy replicating it without it looking dull, but because of the game's throwback 90s setting, on top of its pop culture references that it has sprinkled throughout the levels, its nostalgic factor adds to the charm of the game and makes it overall stand out in an artistic sense. If you can get past its graphics, then you'll be able to enjoy this game for what it is. Something that I also really liked about this game is the audio, or how it was utilized. Sounds really bad, yes, but again, like I've been saying this whole video, the game is geared towards being a 90s shooter, quite literally, which means it brings in all the bells and whistles, including the worst aspects of those games. Not everyone is going to appreciate what it tries to do. Even if its intention is to rewind the clock, it's not going to be for people that have higher standards when it comes to audio design and engineering, as well as higher visual fidelity in games, wanting more crisp sounds and graphics that enhance the experience for them. The music itself, however, though, does have its moments and sounds a lot better in comparison. A lot of it, at least from my hearing, reminded me of Quake 1's soundtrack. A lot of ambience that usually involves a tone that instilled a very unwelcoming vibe in the game. Soundtracks aren't easy to make. Using the wrong tracks can create a tonal shift in the game's art direction, and when things don't mesh, the atmosphere is gone and the immersion is ruined. Thankfully though, all the tracks are in the right place, as well as some synth-based tracks in between, but it's not really a soundtrack that I listen to by itself when I'm doing something else. The low-bit sounds of the weapons and the enemies makes it more like a 90s game rather than just a game trying to be like it. It sounds authentic in that way, and the graphics have the same effect as well. It never really got in the way for me personally, and for the game that it was trying to be, I think it was great overall. Carnal is a game where what you see is what you get. It's a simple but nostalgia-inducing old-school shooter that does a great job of replicating a time period of shooters that it was inspired by, with some fun gameplay, great atmosphere, and attention to detail, and how 90s games were limited by technology, and still creating a good experience overall, creating everything around those limits to make Carnal what it is. And it's incredibly cheap too, like not even a can of Coke cheap, but like a small Mars bar basically, or a lollipop even. It's not going to be for everyone, and it's a game with a lot of flaws, but those flaws were intentionally placed to make the game more authentic and more like a game that was a product of its time, for better or worse. And if you can get past that, then you might still enjoy it, but if not, then it's just not for you. In saying that though, if you don't mind old school inspired games, then this is also a great case study worth looking into, especially if your goal is to make low poly based shooters. The game is quite short as well, can be beaten in just a couple of hours if you have the time. Other than that, Carnal is a very good game in my opinion. I'll also quickly recommend another game by the same person, albeit a smaller one but different, called Gundam Defense Force, where it's a tower defense FPS game where you have both a mech, a minigun, and can place 2 different turrets across the map as you eliminate waves of enemies. Normal mode has 50 waves and boss fights, and infinite mode doesn't have the waves or boss fights, but depending on how much appears on the map, it could affect his CPU, so be careful. I'll place the link for the itch.io page and the game itself too in the description. Both games are incredibly underrated. Go try them out. Stay tuned and thank you for watching.